we're going to introduce Judy Crane and Tom Pecca, and I know that they've been working on some. They've had some technical issues with the presentation, and so we're going to check in with them real quick and see if we got those worked out. So as they log back in and roll with this thing, I just want to say that this is one of the presentations I've really been looking forward to. I know that Judy and Tom have been pioneers in trauma work, and as has been described throughout the last 2 weeks, when we're talking about addiction and addiction treatment, oftentimes, if not most every time, whenever a client or a patient comes in, oftentimes they're dealing with an underlying trauma that is really propagating that addiction. And so I'm really glad to have them here to speak to that today. And it looks like they're having some issues checking in, and so give us 2 seconds here as we kind of troubleshoot that, and hopefully they will get back up. Looks like they're back up to join us here.
Hey.
You guys hear me okay?
Hopefully we got the computer issues out of the way at the beginning.
Right on. Excellent. So I'm going to go ahead and get out of the way, and I'm going to turn it over to you guys, and I want to welcome Judy Crane and Tom Pecca.
Thanks, Glenn.
Hi. I'm really, really happy that so many of you have joined us. This is not my favorite way to do this. As you know, I like being in front of you all and having eye-to-eye connection, but I'm glad you've joined us. What's interesting is the presentation that we're doing has real relevance to the very fact that we are doing this per video. You know, this technical way of being able to connect with you all. I don't know about the rest of you. I'm feeling isolated, alone, detached, and connecting with people in very, very interesting ways. And so what we're going to be talking about, generational trauma, healing the past, the present, and the future, I think is going to be really relevant in this presentation. And so let me just introduce you to Tom Pecca and let him take over for a minute here.
So I'm Tom Pecca, and I've been working with Judy for 52 years because Judy's my mother, which makes it an interesting way to do generational trauma, because we certainly have enough of our own. So the idea for this is we're not going to get too technical. This is a subject that can go very scientific and very technical, and that's not the approach we want to take today. We want to talk about the nuts and bolts of it. We want to talk about how this impacts us as clinicians and what we can do with it, where we might have opportunities that we didn't see. We're going to talk about the realities of working as a therapist in this industry and the way generational trauma impacts the clients in front of us every day. You know, we're looking at the different types of generations that there are. You know, the greatest generation and the things that they went through. They went through World War II, and right before that, the Depression and all those things, and the way that it impacted them. And the silent generation came right after World War II, and the baby boomers right there, Generation X, which is where I am. When I was looking at this this graphic, and I saw how many different things each generation went through. You know, the generational trauma happens in every single generation, and we're certainly going through our own now. So you know, the subject always comes up with nature versus nurture, and which is it? Well, what we're learning from the new science is that it's neither nature nor nurture, it's both. And that's the thing that I certainly have seen in my own career, and I'm sure you have as well. You know, we're seeing both, and if we don't pay attention to both, we're missing the boat.
And if you don't mind, can you go back to the first slide, which I want to point something out. And this is the way Tom and I work. I'm going to interrupt him. I don't want to, but I will. I just want to go back and point out, when we talk about that first generation of the greatest years, you know, we're talking about, for me, my grandfather, my grandmother, and what they went through. And why was that called the greatest years? And it has a lot to do with the traumas that they've gone through, that they went through. And when we talk about the silent years, that also brings me to the fact of remembering why my grandfather was so silent. So as we go through this, I want us to be able to attach to what made that particular number of silent years, why was that important? And the reason that was important was because that was the generation that never spoke about their trauma ever. They never shared their secrets. And I just wanted to point that out particularly because we're going to be talking about some of that later, about the things that we never got to know about the generations that went before us. And I think that was important, and I'm sorry to have interrupted Tom at that point.
No, it's a really important point. I mean, they call it the greatest generation because of what they overcame. And I think that's really important to understand right now, too, is that when we talk about trauma, we often think of it in terms of the horror of it and what it does to us. But traumatic events happen every day. It's how you deal with those traumatic events gives us an opportunity for building strength as well. And that's what we're trying to do with our clients and help our clients understand. So it's like they said in Man's Search for Meaning, it's what they make up with what happened and the purpose and the reason for going through what they went through that makes the difference. And hopefully that's what we're going to do on the show.
And one of the things that I heard recently was one of the first babies that was born after this coronavirus began, all of a sudden some of the nurses started calling that baby the C generation. And I thought, wow, maybe that's the next name for the next generation that's coming up in the midst of all this.
Hey guys, can I interrupt real quick? I apologize. Do you mind speaking up and possibly, Tom, kind of like we talked about earlier, we may have to kill the video to get the audio quality a little bit better. It's a little muffled, that's all.
I also see that we have a little delay. We have a thing here that let's see if I can delete to try and make this a little better. If anybody knows. So is that better, Glenn?
Yeah, that's better. And then maybe try stopping the video and let's see if it increases the audio quality just for right now.
Okay, how are we there?
That sounds better.
Okay. So good, that's all right. I don't want you all to see what I'm doing anyway. Just pay attention to the presentation, keep your eyes off me, we'll all be good.
Sounds
this
wonderful.
Is very different from very different from the way we normally present. Judy and I are very much like to go off the energy of our crowd, and we don't have a crowd right now, so we're getting used to doing this a different way. So we hope you'll bear with us a little bit. And this is a newer presentation. I've only presented it once in Rome back in October, so this is the first time it's being seen. So I'm going to let you read what's there. I'm not going to read to you, but the newer research is showing that it's nature and nurture, not nature or nurture. And I really want to pay close attention to that. I think that's really important for us as clinicians to understand that we need to be looking for both. I mean, most of us, have seen genograms, used genograms, but the importance of bringing family into this, to get the family stories and the family secrets that we don't know, to understand why our clients are impacted the way that they are. I want to show you a scene, and hopefully this will play well. It's from, I do a bit of cinema therapy too, and this is my favorite scene from the movie Parenthood. It's the opening scene. And in this scene, Steve Martin's character talks about why he is the way he is. So hopefully this will work, and Glenn, if it doesn't, you'll let me know.
Yeah, Tom, unfortunately, I can't hear any audio.
Yeah, it's just working. Let me see if I can fix that, sorry. And this is the adventure that we're going through together.
Absolutely.
Fine example of trauma happening in the moment.
Yeah, my trauma. I'm going to try one more time. Let's see if I can See if I can move it work down here. And if not, you're just going to get a lot more of me talking.
Okay, I'm sorry, folks. We're trying to make it work, but it doesn't seem to be sound for the movie. So I'm just going to have to talk a little bit more about what it is. And in this scene, Steve Martin's character is about 8 years old, and he goes back to the baseball game, and his father leaves him with an usher, and he starts to talk to the usher, and he doesn't sound like a kid. He sounds like an adult, and he's talking about how his father's trauma led him to leave him there with this usher, and that this happened every year on his birthday. And it really talks about how what his father went through, that his father never had a male role model to show him how to be a loving father. And so he was never able to teach Steve Martin's character. And passing that on, what happened is Steve Martin's character went to the opposite. He was going to make sure that his kids are super loved, that they get every bit of attention, that everything that they can possibly, every opportunity they can possibly get, they're going to get. And he does the opposite and takes it to the point where he puts too much pressure on him the opposite way. And his one son is autistic, and Steve Martin can't handle the limitations that his son has. So it's about the idea that in generational trauma, what often happens is we replicate what we were shown, or we go to the opposite extreme. So I'm sorry I can't show you that because it's absolutely brilliant. But this is from Gerard Fromm, and it's Lost in Transition. He talks about what we don't talk about still gets transmitted. It still ends up being sent to the next generation in the way that we show who we are to our children. And we could try really hard not to be who our parents were or who the people were that we saw as harmful to us in our experience. But we're still going to show who we are in the way that we interact with the universe. And as we're interacting, our kids pay attention to that. We got to remember that more of what we teach is nonverbal than verbal. So if you're full of anxiety and you're trying your best, but your kids pick up on that anxiety, they see it, and they take some of that anxiety into their own being. They just don't understand why they're anxious. You understand that you're worried about the fact that you can't pay the bills this month, or that you have your own issue being within the marriage, and they don't get it, but they get that there's something wrong. And how many of our clients have we had that? I didn't know what was going on, but I knew something was wrong.
And if I can just say, I can't tell you how often when we're doing family week, or I'm doing work with the family of one of our guests, I'll hear parents say all the time, well, we didn't let them know what was going on. They couldn't possibly have known what was going on. But the truth is that their energy is always there, and kids always respond to the energy. They may not know the facts. They may not know exactly what's going on, but they know that there's something going on. And the feelings around that become very, very enormous in their life. Oftentimes when our families are working on secret stuff, and maybe the father or the mother is finally admitting or telling their child that yes, they had also been abused, or yes, they had been experiencing abandonment and neglect. It comes as a surprise, the event, but not the energy. The energy is always really well known and understood by other members of the family. They just don't have the pieces to put together. When we can put the pieces together, it's like this huge puzzle that goes, oh, now it makes sense.
It's often so crazy making that the only thing they can do is make themselves the reason for the problem. So Costello talked about psychic legacies being passed through the unconscious cues and the stories told. And I love this quote because we're talking about stories that are passed from generation to generation to generation. And there's a story about my great-grandfather. Now, I never met my great-grandfather. My grandfather's, your father's father.
Mm-hmm.
But the stories that have been told about him is that he was a very angry, mean man. There's a story about my grandfather's brother who had lost a leg to, at the turn of the century, he was run over by a Campbell soup cart and he lost his leg. And that this man would take that leg and put it up high so that this boy couldn't reach it because he thought it was funny. And this poor kid would, my great uncle would jump and try and get it. I've been told that story since I was a little boy, and you know, and those behaviors are passed down. I remember my grandfather was a jokester. He would do things, but they were, and he wasn't a mean man. He was a wonderful man, but he would do things that were almost mean. He took my grandmother's shoes and he nailed them to the floor so that when she tried to get them, and there were little things like that he just thought were funny. And in comparison to his father, they weren't anywhere near what his father did. But those stories have come down to me, and what I interpret from the stories I'm told passes down. My kids have now heard the stories in another way, and they're going to make up, but it's kind of like, you know, you make a copy of a copy of a copy, and you lose a little bit in translation each time, and it becomes something new, and that's what's going on. So, you know, I wonder what those stories were like for you before I got.
Well, one of the things that happened as a result of that story is that I wasn't allowed to meet my grandfather. I only met him twice in my life because my father had considered him to be such a cruel man. But I didn't understand and I didn't know. And when I finally met him, here he was, this very dapper, suave man who was a ladies' man. But what I know today is that is exactly the epitome of a man who, number one, cheated on his wife, was a wife batterer, and was cruel to his kids. One of the stories that we hear is that my father grew up during the Depression, and that when there was no food, they would have grass to fry in the kitchen, and that's what they would eat. So the stories come down, and those stories impact who I am today and who I was as a mother and how I raised my children. So the stories are always important, even though we haven't been there experiencing those events in that time and place.
So when I'm working with these clients, I want to hear their family stories. Even if they seem arbitrary, even if they seem like they don't matter, they really do. They're going to give you a clue to what this person had to take to make up what their universe was about. So yeah, tell me those stories. And you know what? The great thing about that is they're not as guarded about the stories usually. They let their guard down and they allow themselves to just be with you. It doesn't feel like you're threatening at some safety that they need. It's been a great tool for me, and it gives me a ton of information.
I think one of the most important things we'll ever do, the important work that we'll do, is finding out what was going on generationally. Because even if you do not know, I mean, I think that's why 23andMe and Ancestry.com are so absolutely popular today, is because we want to know our history, we want to know our past. And that's about learning who I am today, and how important what happened in my family has to do with me and where I am. And so I think as we move along, I'd like to talk more about what that looks like when you're doing work with clients.
And again, if this, I wish we had an audience, because this is where we would be very interactive. So this is very different for us. This is where you'd be asking about your stories and understanding your families. And I think we're missing that, but maybe you can think about that on your own. What stories would you tell us right now? What are your family stories, and how do they impact who you are and who you become, good, bad, and indifferent? It's not a new concept. Carl Jung was talking about this. I love this quote. Who has fully realized that history is not contained in thick books, but lives in our very blood. Whether that's genetic, which there is certainly a genetic component, or affective and behavioral, which I believe there's also that, it doesn't really matter to me, but I know that it's carried in our families. Our family systems certainly create who we are, but that's passed down from one to the next to the next. My kids grow up as far away from the way I grew up as possible. I mean, but they still have parts of where I come from in them, just because I do. I can't, no matter how far away I am from, we grew up in poverty, no matter how far I am away from that poverty, that poverty still impacts who I am as a person. It impacts the things I do, and they watch that. And it's funny, my sons don't understand some of the things I do, why I might save something that to them isn't worth saving, why I might make a choice that to them is like, why are you even doing that? And then I have to explain why. I remember there was this great story about a recipe, and a daughter was making the recipe that her mother had shown her for years and her grandmother had shown her before, and she's cooking up the recipe, and in the middle of it, she takes a small can and she lifts the bottom of the pot and puts the can underneath. And her husband looked at her and said, "Why are you doing that?" Because that's the way you cook this. What are you talking about? Why would you do that? She goes, "I don't know. That's the way I was taught to do it." So she calls her mother and, "Mom, why do we put the can under?" She goes, "I don't know. You're supposed to put the can under. It's part of the way you cook it." And so finally they call the grandmother, and the grandmother says, "Well, we cook it that way because the house I grew up in, the fire was broken on that side. You had to lift the pot up to get it to heat up right." But that third generation away is thinking this is part of the recipe. So we're looking at those things, and where does that live?
And when you think about that, think about what that means in terms of the recipe of your life.
Exactly.
I love that in this piece, Young talks about an impersonal karma transmitted from parents to children. The important part about that is how many of us have no clue about our behaviors and our actions, where they come from, or what that means in terms of what karma we're playing out, because we don't have all the information. And I think when we're doing this work with trauma survivors, the most important thing we can do is help them to pull away and unravel the stories. Because when you unravel the stories, you can really understand who you are, why you're that way, and why you behave the way you do. And I love that somehow we're playing out not just our own karma, but the karma of generations that went before us.
And those generations, I love what he says here is that what they didn't finish, we'll have to finish, is basically what he's saying. Mm-hmm. And I mean, in my own experience, that's been true. The things that my grandfather was unable to do, I've watched my mother do. And the things that she's been unable to do, I'm in the process of doing. And my kids will move down. Now that can work in our benefit and it can work to our detriment. But again, this is young. So, I mean, the turn of the century, they were talking about this. And here we are at the next turn of the century, still talking about it. We got to think of it in two ways too. Generational and intergenerational trauma happens in family units. So we have things that are specific to 1, 2, 3, 4 families that have joined together, and those stories that go through. But there's also cultural trauma and things that impact things on a much greater level, and pockets of culture as well. I was talking to a friend of mine recently going through the COVID-19 crisis that we're going through now, and he was talking about being a gay man going through the AIDS crisis in the 80s and 90s, and he talked about how many of his friends were passing away and the trauma that was happening in the gay and lesbian community at that time, and that pocket of culture. And as he's talking, I'm thinking about the opioid crisis and how that's impacted me being a man in recovery, and how many people I've lost, and the similarity between the two. But the fact that it impacts my pocket of culture as a recovering person in a way that it doesn't impact the general culture, but it does impact my pocket. Slavery for African Americans, the persecution of the Jews. That throughout history, there are these pockets of culture that are affected, and then things that affect culture in a greater way. And right now we're going through something that affects every aspect of culture. We have to talk about epigenetics, and epigenetics is talking about the way that genes are influenced. When we're talking about epigenetics, we're not talking about evolution. In evolution, there are changes that are permanent, that change to help us survive. But in epigenetics, we're talking about how behaviors and environmental influences and different things like that affect our genetic structure for limited times, for 1, 2, 3, 4 generations, not permanently, but it impacts it for that period of time, and it's passed on until it changes. We're looking at the actual changes in that structure. Dan Siegel talks about it. The early experiences shape the structure and function of the brain. Well, all of us know that. The experiences that we go through as children certainly impact who we are, what we believe, and we know that trauma changes the way the brain works. It changes the actual chemistry of the brain, and that is translated into our DNA.
And we certainly see the changes in the brain that trauma creates when we do brain mapping and cognitive repair and neurofeedback. But if we talk about epigenetics, you know, the research shows that after 5 generations that you can change the DNA if through the epigenetics. And what happens, for instance, is I am absolutely an addict, and generationally I was born with that. I mean, I can go back generations. I remember standing, I visited Ireland, and I was in Belfast, standing at the wall where so many Irishmen were in the riots. And as I looked around, I realized that the alcoholism that was created so many generations before me was started there in Ireland. And it was the epitome of my family structure. And so it went from my great-great-grandfather in Ireland to my great-grandmother when she came to the US, to my grandfather, that silent man who sat and made sure that every single day he had his several quarts of beer, even that he took to work, to me, to the point when it came to me, and I always thought that I was the only female addict in the family, the only female alcoholic. I had no idea, and I was feeling such remorse and shame around that. My aunt reminded me that I had 5 great aunts who were alcoholic women as well. But now in my recovery, my children have been in recovery, and we're working toward the 5th generation with my grandchildren. And so if my children are in recovery and my grandchildren have not taken on that onus of addiction, and if they continue to live in a sober lifestyle, their children can be the children of our family who finally move beyond that DNA of addiction.
They're also raised in a culture of recovery. Their grandmother's in recovery, their father's in recovery, their aunt's in recovery. They've been exposed to it in a different way, and it really has changed the culture of our family, if nothing else.
Mm-hmm. It certainly has.
And it's interesting because my ex-wife is not in recovery, so her current husband, he drinks. He's not an alcoholic, but he drinks. It's a common part of their life, and she would invite the kids at New Year's to have a sip of champagne, I think it was. And my youngest son told her, he says, "No, Mom, I can't do that because our family doesn't do well with alcohol." I didn't prompt him to do it. He did it his own. But there's a change there, because I could tell you what, if you'd offered that to me when I was 10 years old, mm-hmm. I would not have said no. As a matter of fact, I remember my grandfather giving my sister beer, mm-hmm. sips of beer. So we've come that far in just a couple of generations, correct. Which is great. Yeah. So when we're talking about, these are more the scientific terms of what epigenetics is, and I invite you to do more research on epigenetics, because I really don't want to get into myotocally and meotocally, and it's I don't want to bore you. I want to entertain you, but I want to talk about what the different things that we're learning can affect epigenetics. So if we look at early life stress, there was this 2003 report where they talked about what happens and nutrition of the mother and things like that in early life stress. But we certainly know how that impacts people. And again, we're going to probably tell a story from our own history. And we notice what is happening with our parents even when we're nonverbal. Matter of fact, we're probably more attuned on a psychic level at that point than any other time. Our survival is contingent on our parents. So we're paying attention to when they're not okay. Being a child of 2 addicts, impacted the way that I saw my universe and the way I saw my safety. And there's different examples of that. There's all these stories from when I was a kid of what we went through. But my father passed away when I was 4.5. My mother's going through all that stress. To think that the stress that she was going through didn't impact me. I mean, you talk after my father died, the way that I reacted.
Well, my children were 18 months, 3 and 4.5. Tom was 4.5. And I came to, and my husband was dead in the bed next to me, and it was an overdose. And what happened with Tom was all of a sudden he started having a twitch of the eye. And I was still very much in my addiction, and I couldn't understand what that was about. But I can tell you this, that I couldn't walk out the door to put the trash out without Tom grabbing a hold of my leg and holding on tight. And I realized that this little boy was terrified that I was going to leave him like his father left him. And it impacted him in a huge way. So that eye twitch is very, very common with early childhood trauma. I didn't know it then. I know it now. But the other thing that was happening was that Tom would have these amazing accidents. I mean, just crazy, falling down, hitting himself with the hammer. One day I had stopped at my mother's, and my car was running, and Tom was in the car. I just ran in to give her a quart of milk. And as I'm coming out the door, Tom had moved the car into a drive, and it started rolling backwards. He jumped out, and the car ran over his leg. All of a sudden, Tom was having all of these crazy accidents, but it really wasn't all of a sudden. It was something that I know today, is that traumatized children often have a lot of accidents because they are distracted and not focused, and in that terrible PTSD that kids experience that we think is something else. And so I used to say things to him like, "Oh, you're so clumsy," and he wasn't clumsy. He wasn't clumsy. He had a mother who wasn't paying attention, and he was under great stress as a trauma survivor of a little boy who lost his father and was feeling all those feelings.
Now, a really important piece here is I didn't know those things about the eye twitch. I didn't know about grabbing at her leg. I didn't remember any of that. So those are pieces I don't have. But I do have the pieces about thinking that I was clumsy. Lazy was another one that was brought down and to me. And for a long time, I owned that. Now, I'm someone who's been a stuntman. I've done stage combat for stage. I've done ballroom dancing. I mean, I've done so many things that would show that I am in no way clumsy. But the minute that I bump into something, the first words out of my mouth are, "Oh, you clumsy. You're such a clumsy fool." That became part of my story. That became part of the way that I defined myself, that is completely inaccurate to who I am. When the truth was, I was a young kid with a lot of anxiety. So yes, I did run over my own leg and broke my leg, which then created all kinds of other issues. Yeah, I was in hospital emergency rooms a lot. I would get cut, and I told the therapist once, "Yeah, I'm clumsy as anything." And he looked at me and said, "No, you weren't clumsy. Nobody watched you, and you didn't know what to do." And that changed my story. Now, why this is important when we're talking about generational trauma is because that changed my story for my kids too. Because had I continued to believe that that was true about me, I would have passed that message down to my kids too. Instead of the message that you can do anything, you can, that it doesn't have to define you. And I'm very grateful that I was able to do that. I'm very grateful that I'm able to help other people change their stories. And I know that that's the best part of my job being a clinician is to have someone who has a belief system that has walled them off for years and help them change that belief system.
So what if we have many clients who come in who oftentimes have come from families with resources, and they've got some privilege, and so good, wonderful things have happened for them in their life. But suppose your father came from nothing, and he created an amazing life of wealth and business, and he's done extraordinary things, and you're the oldest child, and he says to you, "You know what, you're my best buddy." And at 5 years old, all of a sudden, your father and mother divorce, and your father leaves the house, and now you have to protect your mother. Are you still your dad's best buddy, or has the role changed? And for some of our folks, the role changes, and they recognize maybe that they're never going to measure up to the story that dad had. So how are they ever going to be accomplished in any way? And so the story becomes so incredibly important. And if we don't know the story, we often don't know what's going on with our guest. We don't know what's going on with our client. And that's why this story is so important.
So one of the different ways that epigenetics occur is definitely in addiction, and that's what this slide is about, is that transgenerational epigenetic inheritance of addictive phenotypes has been noted to occur in preclinical studies. That sounds wonderful, but and that's the truth. How many of us have seen that? How many of us seen that addiction and alcoholism often skip a generation? You know, so we definitely know that it goes in there, and we're picking that up. And why wouldn't it? If our family members have a coping mechanism for their anxiety, and we note that coping mechanism, maladaptive or not, why wouldn't we pick it up? Or if we saw it and rejected it. And that's one of the things that happened for me, is I watched my mother's alcoholism and addiction, and I said, that's not going to happen to me. So I used alcohol and drugs, but I would never let myself get too far with it, because I didn't want to be like mom. But what I did is I picked up as many process addictions as I possibly could, because that was different. And now I watch my kids, and I watch that they're more prone to pick up things like media as a way to cope, food as a way to cope, and directly tied to my generational coping mechanisms. I don't know if this, I'm going to try this, and Glenn, you tell me if you can hear this or not. We'll give it one more shot.
Oh God, I need a drink.
Can you hear that, Glenn?
Hi, I'm Christy, and
Yep, sounds good.
I've been sober 118 days. Oh, don't applaud that. They've been the worst 118 days of my life. The only reason I'm here is because I didn't want to turn into my mother, and I did anyway. Yeah, I drank like her. I went through men like her. I was selfish to my kids, just like she was. And I didn't know how to live any other way because she was my only role model. I mean, some mothers teach their daughters how to bake. Mine taught me how to beat a cavity search and still feel like a lady. Anyway, thanks for letting me share. And I cannot tell you how comforting it is to be in a room with people who are just as screwed up as I am, so.
Hi, I'm Jim, and I'm an alcoholic.
Hi, Jim. Aren't you a little old to be blaming all your problems on your mother? Hi, Mom.
Well, it's something that's really important there is when Tom finally went to treatment, he went to treatment and came home on a little leave for Thanksgiving, and we were sitting at dinner, and he's telling me about how he's having to go to AA and NA and OA and GA, and then he said he was going to SLAA, and I was very newly a therapist, I mean really young therapist, and I said, what's SLAA? He said sex and love addiction, and I was horrified. Oh my God, I knew I was responsible for all the other stuff, but what did I do to make him a sex addict? It was the most horrifying experience of my life as a mother.
Which is interesting because, I mean, these process addictions are way more common than alcoholism and substance addiction in families, at least. Heck, I come from an Italian family, and our process addictions are very easy to see anytime we get together. There's food everywhere. As a matter of fact, that's how we showed love. Well, that certainly plays into my process addictions. I hope you were able to see that well. We have a screen up here, and there was a little bit of a delay that I'm hoping you're not getting.
God, I need it.
So, these are some of the different studies that talk about the transgenerational inheritance of anxiety. And that's just one that we see all the time. How many times have you had a client who comes into your office and you go, well, how long have you been experiencing this anxiety? And they said, since I was about 4. Well, what in the world does a 4-year-old have to be anxious about? You know, how would they even be able to understand anxiety? Now, I have somebody here sitting here laughing at me because, well, when I was 4, but it's usually because they're picking up on the anxiety of their family or the great tumult in their family. And I get that. I came from, again, parents of 2 addicts. My father passed away. There was a lot of reason to be anxious in that family, but I've had it in families where there shouldn't have been. And what they didn't know is what mom and dad were going through in the background. The reasons why mom and dad were anxious and how they picked up on that anxiety and took it on as their own. So there's something, if I understand that I'm anxious because a bill's due and I can't pay it, that's one thing. But if I'm anxious and I have no reason to be and I don't know why, then I have to make something up. And the thing I'm going to make up about why I'm anxious is the world's not safe and I'm not okay. And how many of our clients have carried that on, especially trauma survivors? And also takes away some of their ability to cope and to deal with those things as they happen. Because if you're already anxious and bad things start happening.
And suppose mom, we have to relate this as well to what happens in utero. Suppose mom is incredibly anxious during her pregnancy. Whatever the mom is experiencing in utero, the baby experiences, no matter what. And certainly when I was pregnant with my children, there was a lot going on. There were a lot of crazy, insane things going on that happens in an addict's life. And what I would like to point out is how many of our clients can so easily say, I'm so anxious, I'm so anxious. If you take their blood pressure, if you take their pulse, nothing is changing. Their body is not saying that they're anxious, but that whole idea of anxiety has been with them for so long that it's the norm. Anxiety is their norm, and they don't know what to do with what happens when they're at peace, because it doesn't feel like peace. It feels uncomfortable to be in a place. And so that's part of the help we have to give our folks in being able to help them identify what exactly does that mean, anxious? Or what does that mean, I'm angry or I'm depressed? Oftentimes their definition is not a definition that's working.
Absolutely. So the same holds true for depression, and it passes down the same way in how I deal with things. So in this 2019 study, they're showing that environmentally induced issues created genetic changes in the paternal germline. So the parents passed it on. That's basically what it is. So here's another little video to show kind of an idea of how that might happen.
And I love this. It'll teach you that we don't need therapists.
Michael, it's your turn.
Thank God. We go after this.
The angry family. The daddy was mad at the mommy. The mommy was mad at the daddy. Mommy and daddy were very mad at the grandpa. The grandma got mad at everybody.
I did not. Wonderful.
The grown-ups were always very loud. It hurt the kids' ears. The end.
Michael.
I love that scene. And the reason I love that scene is because how many of our families are like that? And again, that's an Italian family. I come from an Italian family. We're loud. But the kid has to make up what that means. And this child made up angry. And I don't know that it was always angry, but that's what he decided it was. And he's going to pass down his way to cope with that is to tell this story and to show him how many of us had to make up what was going on in our families and decided because of that one thing meant another thing. Another way this happens is in fear conditioning. And there's been tons of studies on fear conditioning. This is one on mice and showed that it was passed down and the fear response. My favorite one is one that was done with these monkeys. And they took the 5 monkeys, they put them in a cage, and in the middle there was a ladder and bananas at the top. And every time that a monkey would go up and try and get the bananas, they would throw cold water on the other monkeys. So it got to the point where anytime a monkey would try to go up and get bananas, the other monkeys would beat them up and wouldn't allow them. So after a while, they started to change the monkeys out. And you got to the point about 3 generations later, so 15 monkeys later, there were 5 monkeys in there who had never been in there when water was thrown on a monkey. They stopped doing it after the first 5 monkeys. But every new monkey learned that what you do when a monkey goes up that ladder is you beat them up. So that's what they started doing. So these are 5 monkeys who had never had cold water thrown on them for any reason, and they're beating up any monkey that tries to get the bananas because it's what they were taught and what they were learned. It was passed down through 3 generations.
And if I can just say, when you consider the way that war is created all over this globe and the ethnicities of the various ethnicities that just because you're Italian and I'm Romanian, we are enemies. And I realize that's not a true statement, but that we're enemies and that it is absolutely an inherited experience for folks as they're growing up. And I wonder what it would be like if we were able to recondition whole ethnicities.
Culture as a genre, that's the one thing is we're becoming more and more of a global culture. That gives us opportunity, but also as we've seen, as we become more of a global culture, even nationally, we're becoming more fractured. No matter what side of belief system you're on, we tend not to believe the other side and the other side is wrong. Doesn't matter what is said, they're wrong. And that's part of what we've got to do as a culture to come back together is to take away an enemy. We don't need an enemy. There's no more cold water being thrown on us. We don't have to beat anybody up. And hopefully we'll be able to learn that as a culture. I'm just going to go really quick through some of the research before we start talking about the pieces of this. But there was a research, the Holocaust exposure induced intergenerational effects on methylation. And what they did is, this is a very small study, but there was about 32 survivors of the Holocaust. And 22 of their children. And what they found in the offspring, in the 32 survivors, there was a change in methylation one way. And in the 22 children, there was a change, but it was in the opposite way. So we don't know what that means yet, but what we do know is that there is absolutely an impact on both the trauma survivor and the offspring of the trauma survivor. Still a lot more work to do. Again, it's a really small study, but it's a really interesting one. Go ahead.
Anecdotally, what some of us have recognized is that when we get to the 3rd generation of Holocaust survivors, oftentimes what we will see is an absolute example of eating disorders. And part of that is about the stories that we have been told throughout history. And so when the generations before us were starving and were unable to be fed, and you know, I can't tell you how often I hear somebody say, well, she looks like a Holocaust survivor. With eating disordered clients, we need to check on what their generations before them were, because oftentimes that is absolutely a piece of what's happening for them. And I have seen that repeatedly. And it happened for us, the first time was when one of our eating disordered clients was, we were just really struggling, and her mother sent us some pictures of the whole family gathering. And every one of those women in that family clearly had an eating disorder or had deprived themselves of food. And so we have to pay attention to that. My family, my poor children are doomed, because on my side, it's Irish, on their father's side, it's Italian. So we have the potato famine. Guess what? When I went to Ireland, when you're sitting down at a meal, you don't just get one potato, you get 3 different kinds of potatoes. And so do we have an issue with weight? Yeah. And in the Italian side, it's mangia, 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 and we have to eat, and it's love. And, you know, when we can pay attention to how did this happen, that here I am 4 generations later, and I'm still carrying the cross of the potato famine, which happened in 1850.
So if we go back to what Young said, what our parents don't work out, what our ancestors don't work out, we have to. So if I'm still reacting to a traumatic event that happened before I was born, you know, we know that PTSD is reacting to life as if a traumatic event is waiting to happen again that happened to us. But when we're talking about generational trauma, I'm reacting to an event that happened before I was born, isn't going to happen again, but I'm still waiting for it in some way. There was another piece of research that was done in 2019, Dora Costa. She went back and looked at the history of Civil War POW survivors. And then she went and looked at the children, and she went through the records of 4,600 children of POWs. And what she found was there was an 11% higher mortality rate. 11% higher. That is incredibly significant. And then to make it even more so, she looked at the children of those POW survivors who were born before their fathers went to war, and that mortality rate doesn't exist there. So there's good anecdotal evidence there that there's definitely an influence on a trauma survivor genetically passed down to their kids, whether that is affectively and behaviorally or straight through genetics, I don't know. I'm guessing that it's both. But what I would love to know is what happened to the children of those children. And I don't know if there's a way to do that study, but that would tell us a whole lot. And then there's Holodomor, and Holodomor was in the Soviet Union, the Ukraine. And between 1932 and 1933, Stalin's regime starved the Ukrainians out. It was a Holocaust in their minds. So he did a qualitative study of 45 people from 3 generations, 15 Ukrainian families. And he looked at how many different things were affected through that family. And what he says is each generation seemed to kind of learn from the previous one, with survivors telling children, don't trust others, don't trust the world. And again, how much of the work we do is changing those belief systems. And if you don't trust others and you don't trust the world, how are you going to be able to function in that world? Working with trauma survivors, I mean, we at the guest house, that's what we do. We work with trauma survivors every day. And changing those core belief systems are everything. I was working with a family, and I can say because the client gave me permission to talk about it. And we were looking at why this client has such a shame core, because it doesn't make sense with who he was. There's one incident with a teacher that happened that kind of set everything off. But before that, you know, his family said it wasn't there. But then the family his mother and father started talking about how they moved to this small town, and how in this small town they were ostracized and treated very badly by the other members of the community. And the mother talked about the impact it was having on her, how it was a crisis of faith for her. And the father got sick at that point and almost died. And all these things are happening at the same time that this child is going through some trauma at school, and how it impacted every member of that family and carried on. And it's still impacting this gentleman 30 years later, you know? Now, the good thing is he's dealing with it. His family's willing to talk about it, willing to put those pieces together, because then the mother started to talk about things that happened to her and the shame that she carried. And his father came out and started to talk about how an incident with a teacher created the shame that he carried. And then talked about how the same thing happened to his father. So there's trauma repetition in 3 generations of this family centered around teachers shaming kids, which thank God is different today. But
the most exciting work that I think that we do is when we can begin to work with the whole family. I have somebody sitting in the room here today who I just love and admire, and every single member of her family on all sides came at one point or another to do this trauma work, and they each did their own work, and then they did the family work together. And they were able to lift some terrible traumas that had happened in the family. And the dilemma is that when we do this really deep, intensive trauma work with our clients, and then we have to send them home to families who have not done their own trauma work, there is a real, there's a misstep, there's a disconnect. And sometimes what I feel that's imperative is you can't go back to that system and be well until that family gets well. And that's some of the best work that we do, is that we get a chance to do intensives with the families. And our guests are, as I said, are often amazed that they find out so much more about their family that they didn't know, and it all begins to make sense.
So it's not just family systems, it's generational trauma work at the same time. So a lot of this we've been doing in different ways forever. So that's the Hold-A-More study. So let's talk about cultural trauma a little bit. Let's talk about what's happening right now. So we have now the flu pandemic, and these are great cultural crises that have happened over and over and over and over again. Every generation faces them. We certainly have faced things before with 9/11, and now we're facing it again with the coronavirus. An opportunity for cultural growth, but an opportunity for cultural trauma. And unfortunately, it's creating both. And it's interesting to me when I started to do some research on the pandemic of the Spanish flu, and some of the survivors talked about how for years and years later, how they wouldn't gather in large groups anymore, how they wore masks for years. This was 1918. This was right after World War I. So they had two huge traumas in a row, and how much it impacted. Now, we don't remember that. We don't talk about that. That is only 100 years ago. It's not so long that we shouldn't know the stories, but that's what happens, as we saw in the other slides. It falls out of discourse, but it doesn't fall out of the way that we deal with things and the way that it impacts us, even though we don't know that it's impacting us.
I think that video that you just saw with each of those succeeding traumatic cultural events, there is such power. I look at that and I realize that over the years, I have worked with whole families from every one of those terrible traumatic events that generationally they've experienced those events, including my own family. And here we are today. Here we are today, and I think it is poignant to be able to see this big, incredible coronavirus coming at us, and how much of what's happening in the world today has been replicated over the years. And the difference is that because of social media, because of TV and movies and constant 24-hour news, we are so very aware of the whole world is experiencing this together, all of us together at the same time, which has never, ever happened before in that way. Not a global event at this level.
I want you to think about how before coronavirus started to hit us fully, we were watching pictures of how the Italian culture was dealing with it. Do you remember before we were in social isolation, we were watching Italians sing on their balconies, and how much that impacted what we knew was coming. And now we're doing the same things. Another important point in my 20 plus years of trauma therapy work, and Judy's got more than that. The one thing that we notice is each time these great generational things happen, you see an influx of patients, obviously, but there's more to it than that. What we've noticed is all the clients that we worked with who came from us to us supposedly because of 9/11. When we look deeper, there was a trauma long before that, and oftentimes a generational familial trauma, that the current trauma took away their ability to cope. It was the straw that broke the camel's back. We saw that with 9/11. We saw that with Hurricane Katrina. We see that with the soldiers that we have been able to work with who were survivors of war. Almost always, these aren't survivors of single event traumas. These are survivors of historical trauma that comes up along with the generational trauma. It's a really important thing to remember, because that's what we're going to be dealing with when this is over.
And if you can put it in this perspective, when we started doing this work, so I started 30 years ago doing this work, and what we're looking at is layers and layers and layers of trauma. And so many of you know about doing trauma eggs and what that looks like. And that is the essence of what happens to the human spirit and how we manage to function in the world. And at that point, when that final straw happens and we no longer have the resilience in that moment to deal with it. And I know Tom knows this as well, I have huge concerns about what we have to do to mobilize our industry for what is coming at the end of this coronavirus. We have got to be able to save each other. We have got to be able to be available for one another. There are, and we're going to move on with this particular piece so we can show you.
Because we're talking about those pockets again, and here's what's happening to the health workers. Most of us have seen this. The health workers are on the front lines the same way we're on the front lines for the opioid crisis. And we know what that feels like. We know the trauma that's created within so many of us. We're watching rates of relapse go up so much. The one thing that Judy and I definitely have seen over our years too is that trauma survivors tend to work in the help fields. We're therapists, we're nurses, we're doctors, we're teachers. We are all those things because we know how to deal with crisis, and we're looking for purpose to overcome the things that happened to us in our childhood. But what that says is so many of us that are already trauma survivors are standing on the front lines dealing with this today. And so many of them are going to deal with it. They're going to step up. They're going to be strong. They're going to show us that. And then afterwards, they're going to collapse. Because when we can deal with trauma when it happens as trauma survivors, what we can't deal with is when it stops. And we have to deal with everything that we didn't deal with while we were working on just getting through.
I love, and I've shared this repeatedly, that I love when I have a community of guests, or what our clients we call guests, a community of guests, and things are moving along, and all of a sudden there's something huge that happens, like this virus. And I want to tell you, our folks can handle this. One year we had 4 hurricanes in a row, 1, 2, 3, one after another. Mm-hmm. Our clients were extraordinary. Nothing bothered them until it was done. And then when things settled, that's when they fall apart. And that's when we fall apart. We step up, we give it everything that we've got. We give Corona the finger like this nurse is giving, and we get in there and we fight. And then in the end, then we collapse. But the amount of energy, the amount of resilience, the fight that we give in those moments of trauma is extraordinary. And we've been, for many of us, we've been doing this our whole life until one layer too many and we're done. And I know, I know that if you're in this industry, and most of you listening to this are, we have to be ready. We have to be ready because they're going to need us out there. They need us now.
So there's interruptions to our cultural norms, and These are the things we're going through right now. Things that are not normal are becoming the new normal. We don't go to bars and restaurants anymore. My kids are doing school on computer just like everybody else is, which is, I got an article right before we came on, so I couldn't put it in here, but it talks about how much this is going to change our kids. Mm-hmm. Our kids are losing their proms, they're losing their graduations, they're losing all these really important events to them. And to us, that may seem like not that big a deal, but if you've been waiting for 4 years to be able to walk and get your self-esteem out of getting that graduation, that diploma, and suddenly it's gone, it's a huge deal to them.
It's a huge deal. And I don't know if you've seen it, but on Facebook, folks are putting their senior picture up to give, to applaud our seniors that are supposed to be graduating, and just in support. And I thought that was kind of an interesting way to support our kids.
And I encourage us not to poo-poo it off, because in comparison to someone dying, yes, it's not that big. But the one thing we know about trauma for sure is that trauma is perception. My trauma is my trauma. It doesn't matter what yours is. We can't compare the two. If it feels traumatic to me, it is. Now, the kids aren't dying from this disease. The older folks are. So to them, it's a little different. Now, they're going to lose their fathers, their mothers, their grandmothers. And of course, that is a huge trauma that's different. But let's not avoid looking at those other traumas too. Changes the way we do anything. Our kids are going to change the way they interact with each other, at least for a while. And that's going to have an impact. Social norms are important. And when we change social norms, it has an impact.
I listened to Cuomo today, Governor Cuomo, and I thought, you know, what a brilliant, brilliant man to be able to say the picture of those kids with masks on. I had to be out in the community today to several places, doctor's offices, a few things, and nobody thinks about it. Everybody's wearing a mask. And we're, you know, like, I want your mask because it's pink and I only have a white one. And how amazing that we have made the adjustments. And Governor Cuomo is saying exactly the thing. How we all stepped up as a human species, stepped up and began to protect ourselves and to protect each other, and to take the steps that are necessary to be able to do that. And what are the chances that if somebody said to me, I'm sorry, you got to go and stay in your house for a month and don't come out and social distance. When that first happened, so what are you talking about? That's not possible. And here we find out not only is it possible, but we are willing to go to any length to be able to save each other.
Okay, so we're getting closer to our stop time. So I know we're not going to get through everything we have, so we're going to skip around a little bit, but we did want to do this piece because, again, we're changing cultural norms. Now, we're going to be dealing with folks who those cultural norms have changed and they don't deal with it in an adaptive way. But I wanted to look at some of the adaptive ways. So this is a funeral that happened right at the beginning of social distancing.
I think the thing about Mom that's going to carry on forever, you know, the thing that she'll most be remembered for here in her community is her love for the outdoors and gardening. And so much of the beauty that you see around here, even just down a country road, is probably because my mom stopped and planted those flowers there, planted that tree. And I think that's the beauty that we're going to see springing up here in the next couple months is going to be encouraging to all of us, because a lot of it is something that Mom planted maybe years ago.
Special part of our early memories.
I guess the important thing that we wanted to be able to accomplish here was being able to reach out to the community the way that my mom would and the way that my mom did and everything. My mom was resourceful and innovative and creative in ways that would have produced something like this. So it's been great that we are all together as a family right now. But Mom was always focused on others. So this was a way for the other people who have been locked down in their homes, grieving over Mom's passing, come out and see that we're all okay. Everything's going to be okay.
And that's it. Everything's going to be okay. I love watching that woman. She puts on her glove, but she still needs to reach out and touch. Still needs to show the connection. How are we showing our families the reality of what we're in, but that we're going to be okay? because that's how you stop trauma. That's how you stop PTSD, is you got to believe you're going to be okay. If you believe you're not going to be okay, I got to wait and protect myself until I don't any longer. So part of our job is helping these people feel okay.
The amazing thing is that we are having an opportunity globally to intervene on PTSD, because we can intervene on PTSD when we can soothe each other, when we can make sense of what's happening, and we can support one another. And we're doing that in a really global way.
I'm going to skip past a couple of these, but this is really important. So this is Dan Siegel. Some people think it's about what happened in a parent's childhood. It's not. It's how the parents make sense of what happened. I love this quote because this is everything we're talking about, because we're trying to look at generational trauma. How do we make sense of it? How do we help our folks make sense of their past in a way that allows them to move forward, that lets them give themselves permission to get well, that lets them give themselves permission to let go of shame, that lets them give themselves permission. And I keep saying that because that's our job, is to find a way to help them give themselves permission to move forward. I love this piece. This is a survivor of the 1918 flu. He's from Sarasota, Florida. 107 years old when he did these quotes. He ran for Congress at 100 years old, and he barely lost. But Joe Newman, and what he said is, there are those of us who say, well, this too shall go away, and it will. But at what cost, at what expense? You have to be my crutch. I have to be yours. It's been the way through every crisis we've had. And then we find, when we do look back, that's what got us through. I can't think of a better way to deal adaptively with trauma than exactly what he's saying. How do we pass that on to our folks, the people we're working with? How do we help them do that? Not only for this, but for the traumas of the past.
And if we could just tell you this, the most important thing that you can ask people is, tell me your story. Tell me your story. Because we all are making a story about what's happening for us.
Tell me your family story too.
Mm-hmm.
So I'm going to play this piece because I love it. And this is, and one of the things we have with media now, media is a curse and a blessing. In some ways we see far too much and more than we should, and stay stuck in things that maybe we shouldn't stay stuck in, but it also gives us an opportunity to deal. So this family did a version of a song from Les Miserables, and it's too good not to share.
Another day, another destiny, shopping for online delivery. Trying to get a lead to find there's nothing till September time. One day, today. How can I play when we are parting? One day more, grandparents are miles away. They can't work Skype, we're broken hearted. One day alone, my will we have for me to go. Almost happy with me, blue. I am bored of being with you. Here to take us through. Always were until we grew. Loving nothing that we share. One more day upon my do we get a change of clothes? Teachers fill up Google Classroom. Our exams are moving. Do I change my underwear? Which every bathroom? Is now the day?
Let's just let them run amok. We're not ready for these schoolboys, cause they just don't give a fuck.
See how long we sigh. Clapping for the NHS can make you cry. Here's a little walk, there's a little ride. Such a little bummer when we're stuck in time.
What they do when you begin it. There's enough for the vaccine.
It's just too good to not to share. And I want you to think about this. Is that an adaptive way to cope? Because they're looking at the father drinking, the mother sighing, which can certainly be anxiety and depression and all these things, but they found a way to confront it and deal with it in a way that moves them forward. They're not ignoring it, but they're dealing with it. To me, I love that. And I hope that's what I'm doing with my family. I hope it's.
Absolutely love it.
So. Oh, this is they turned me into a meme. So this was my take on what we have to do. And it's just like individual trauma, to survive this, we must find purpose and meaning for our suffering. This pandemic will end, and we survivors will define the meaning of this period of time. We must become better as a people, more loving, more caring, and more aware of our interconnectedness. We must grieve what we will lose and learn a deeper and greater appreciation for what we hold on to. We must cherish what we learned about our ability to survive and grow as a human race. This is not just a global trauma, it's a global opportunity to acknowledge how fragile life is and how much we need each other. And that's the whole point of the entire presentation is, yes, the trauma is there. What we do with it matters. What we do with it and how we move forward. We're going to move past here. There's one that Judy loves that she wants to show you. And then we'll take questions. So I'm going to move on to the next.
You know, everything discussed here is pretty.
Did we lose it?
No, it was before him.
Okay, this is from Everybody Loves Raymond. In this scene, Ray decides to tell his wife that he's having therapy so that he can actually go to the track and bet on horses. Well, his brother picks up on it and he goes along. So now they're both doing therapy together, and then dad comes in too. So this is them talking about what they're going to tell the wives. And this is why Judy says everybody can be their own therapist.
Everybody can be their own therapist.
You were withdrawn from your relationship with us because your father was like that with you? That's friggin' great.
Very good, Raymond.
Yeah. No, because it's like what you were talking about the other day. I'm kind of a lousy dad because of him, so I just back it up one more to Grandpa Joe. Yeah, and his dad was the worst. My Grandpa Sal.
Oh, yeah?
Oh, yeah, Grandpa Sal, very scary. He once made Mussolini wet himself. My dad used to tell me horrible stories about how his father used to hit him when he wasn't hitting me.
Grandpa Joe hit you?
Sure, I got hit every day. Wow, Dad. I didn't know that it was like that for you. It was like that for everybody. That's just the way it was. So your dad's dad hit him, he hit you, and you never really hit us. I couldn't. I don't know. I was always weaker than him.
Maybe you didn't want to be like him.
I didn't. The girls will buy that.
Oh, yeah. They'll eat it up like a bag of candy.
Come on, let's bet the next race on three.
And that, my friends, is not just trauma resolution, but that's intergenerational karma healing.
So if we're going to work with generational trauma, the more family work you can do, the better. I know that's not always possible. So as much information as you can get is possible. And that's where we're going to end our presentation today, with a few minutes to spare for questions. Let me just end the show.
I want to say that if you're wondering about your family story, I do intensives, and oftentimes I will ask people, please, you may not know some of your family history. Call your mom tonight and ask. Call your aunt tonight and ask. Call your brother and ask him what it was like for him. Call the people around you that you've never talked to about what was going on in your family and ask the questions. Amazingly, they often will answer. And that begins a dialogue that the family never, ever would have started without you.
So we have some questions that we're going to try and answer some questions before we close off. And one easy one here is from Mario, is pornography an addiction? Well, there's certainly a lot of debate about that, and the DSM will tell you one thing, but being a recovering sex addict, I can tell you that it absolutely is an addiction in my mind. It affects the same parts of the brain that cocaine does. And if you are using something in an addictive manner, I don't care if you call it sexual compulsivity or sexual addiction, and as a certified sex addiction therapist, if you're using it in an addictive manner, we got to treat it the same way we would as an addiction, in my opinion. The DSM is going to tell you something different. So from Timothy Sullivan, connection is said to be the opposite of addiction. Gabor Mate. Stigma affects the ability of people to connect if they suffer from addiction. How do you suggest using anonymous online connection technologies to get more people into contact with treatment outreach? Keeping in mind that many people suffer from not only stigma issues, but denial as well. I think it's a great question. I think it's something we're seeing today with Zoom meetings. I think that's a piece of cultural norms that have been changed, that you get up and you go to an AA meeting or an NA meeting or an SLA meeting, and we're doing all these meetings online now. And it's become something completely different that I think is going to stick around. And I think a big part of it is exactly what you said, is it's a way to do that more anonymously and still keep a connection. I have less of an excuse not to get on a screen. Now, I don't think it's the be all end all, because I think there's something to be said for that person to person connection that I don't want to lose either, but at least it gives us another way.
I'm amazed because I'm very much a, like I avoid Skype at all cost. I don't like to do Skype therapy, but I can tell you this, Zoom meetings have saved my life. I have some dear friends, and my home group is called Winners on the Road. And because they're people that I travel with and that I see out there all over the country. And I was missing them so much because that's where I make my connections. And we've been blessed to be able to have those meetings. And I can't tell you how excited I am to see their faces pop up on the screen and to be able to laugh and have community with them. And I'm surprised. I'm surprised because it's not what I anticipated it would be, and I don't know what will happen if I miss it. And so I'm always there. And so yes, I think we have to be aware that a lot is going to change, and we will make adjustments because that's what human beings do.
Right. We won't be able to get to every question, but we get to some here. I think this one's important, from Yolanda Herring. African Americans are also a group that is drastically impacted by trauma. No one wants to talk about it because people want to forget the layers of slavery, but slavery caused Black people to be victimized on so many different levels and taught to victimize each other. The inequality and injustice has and continues to be a direct result of low self-esteem, low social and economic status. Absolutely. I think one of the easiest places to look to understand generational trauma is in the African American community, and the different layers of being taught that one skin color, what we do to someone who is darker within the African American culture, even onto themselves, how they treat each other at times, how we treat them, how different types of hairstyle, just those pieces are definitely pieces of generational trauma passed down from one family to the next family, one generation to the next generation, one culture to another culture. There is so much that and it continues to be passed down in through economic injustice, and it's one of the places that we can definitely explore much deeper. And I did put it in the presentation. There aren't enough studies on it. The studies tend to go more towards the Holocaust, the Civil War, but the more studies should be done on that, absolutely. Let's see here. Wow, this one might be, I think this might be our last one. From Mario Meckel, is post-traumatic stress disorder curable? No and yes. Can you cure it? No, but you can, I think trauma resolution, and Judy, you'll give yours. Trauma resolution is not to not have trauma anymore. You always have trauma. It's that it impacts me less often, and the way that I deal with it, I recognize it quicker, I deal with it quicker, it doesn't impact me as long. So if we're saying that trauma is created from intensity and duration, the intensity of the event and how often it happens to us, well, I think trauma resolution is along the same line. The intensity of the trauma reactivity lessens, and the amount of times that it happens lessens. That's trauma resolution, not I don't have trauma anymore. So I hope that answers it.
One really good way of let me just say this. What trauma resolution does is it helps us to grieve the traumas that we experienced, and it helps us to change the perception so that we can look at where are the positive, powerful pieces of our survivorhood that have been created as a result of that. So we change that perception. But here's the bottom line. Trauma resides in the sensory, in the body, just in the cellular level. And so, for instance, if I were to have electric shock therapy, my mind might not remember the trauma, but my body would. So we're always having to heal all those pieces of ourselves. And so sometimes our body will respond to things which trigger those old behaviors, those old feelings of PTSD. But again, when there's trauma resolution, it doesn't mean it's resolved forever. It means it's lost and lessened its impact on us in some ways.
So we've really enjoyed doing this presentation. It's very different doing it without the audience here with us, but we hope you got a sense of what we were talking about. We hope it was helpful and informative. And with that, we'll turn it back over to Glenn.
Thank you so much, Glenn. It was just lovely.